At 7 o'clock in the morning on December 5, 1944, Sergeant George Burns crouched in the doorway of a battered concrete building in Lucherberg, Germany, watching the sky turn from black to grey as artillery shells screamed overhead. The temperature hovered just above freezing. His breath came in short white puffs that hung in the air before dissolving. Inside the building behind him, what remained of the 2nd Platoon of Company F huddled against the walls fewer than 20 men, where there should have been 40. 2 squads had already sustained 50% casualties in the initial assault on this small village near the Roer River. The survivors were exhausted, low on ammunition, and waiting for what they knew was coming. The Wehrmacht counterattack began without warning. Burns heard it before he saw it, the unmistakable grinding clatter of tank treads on cobblestones, the deep rumble of a Maybach engine reverberating between the stone buildings. Then the smoke cleared from the previous night's fighting, and there it was. A Tiger I heavy tank, 56 tons of steel and violence, its long 88mm cannon sweeping slowly across the village square. A German soldier stood in the open turret hatch, directing fire, his voice carrying across the frozen morning air as he called out targets. The tank opened fire. The first shell struck an American ammunition truck parked in the square. The explosion lifted the vehicle 3 feet off the ground before it disintegrated into a ball of orange flame. Rounds of small arms ammunition began cooking off inside the burning wreckage, the sharp crack of cartridges detonating mixing with the deeper boom of artillery. Smoke and fire billowed into the grey morning sky. The Tiger fired again, methodically, its cannon punching through walls that had stood for 300 years as if they were made of paper. Burns knew exactly what that tank represented. The Tiger I was the most feared weapon. In the German arsenal, a 60-ton monster with armour 100mm thick on its frontal plate, nearly 4 inches of hardened steel, that could shrug off most Allied tank guns at combat ranges. Its 88mm main gun, derived from the legendary Flak 36 anti-aircraft cannon, could destroy any Allied tank in existence from over 2,000 metres away. A single Tiger, properly handled, could, and often did, hold off entire armoured columns. Wehrmacht tank crews called it their Wunderwaffe, their wonder weapon. American soldiers called it something far less printable. German propaganda had spent 3 years cultivating the Tiger's mystique. Newsreels showed the massive tanks crushing Soviet armour at Kursk, shrugging off direct hits that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. Wehrmacht briefings assured tank crews that their frontal armour was impervious to all but the heaviest Allied weapons. The Tiger's reputation had become so fearsome that Allied intelligence reported cases of armoured units refusing to engage when a Tiger was suspected to be in the area, not from cowardice, but from cold tactical calculation. Why sacrifice an entire platoon of Shermans against a tank that could destroy them all before they got within effective range? The crews themselves believed it. They had reason to. The Tiger's 100mm of frontal armour, when properly angled, could deflect or absorb hits from the American 75mm cannon, the British 6-pounder, even the Soviet 76mm gun. Only the British 17-pounder, the Soviet 122mm, or a lucky shot from close range, stood any chance of penetrating. And who in their right mind would try to close with a Tiger? What the Germans did not know, what they could not have anticipated, was that standing in that doorway in Lucherberg was a 23-year-old sergeant from New York who was about to prove every assumption wrong. George Burns was not a tanker. He was not an anti-tank specialist. He was an infantryman, a foot soldier with a rifle and whatever else he could carry on his back. And in the next 15 minutes, he would accomplish something that Wehrmacht doctrine insisted was impossible. He would destroy a Tiger 30 heavy tank with a weapon the Germans had already dismissed as inadequate for the task. The story of that morning, and the weapon that made it possible, begins not on a frozen German battlefield, but in a scrap pile at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, nearly 3 years earlier. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In the spring of 1942, Lieutenant Edward Uhl of the United States Army Ordnance Department faced an impossible problem. The War Department had given him a weapon, the M10-shaped charge grenade that could theoretically destroy any tank. then in service. The grenade used a revolutionary technology called the Monroe effect, named after American scientist Charles Monroe, who had discovered in 1888 that a cavity in an explosive charge could focus the detonation into a concentrated jet capable of penetrating armor plate. By lining that cavity with metal, engineers could create what they called a shaped charge, a device that punched through steel like a blowtorch through butter. The problem was delivery. The M10 grenade weighed 3.5 pounds, far too heavy to throw with any accuracy, too heavy even to launch from a rifle. The only practical way to use the weapon was for an infantryman to physically walk up to an enemy tank and place the grenade against its armor, a suicidal proposition that no soldier could reasonably be expected to attempt. WWII needed a way to deliver that grenade from a safe distance, and he needed it fast. German tanks were already rolling across North Africa, and American armor was hopelessly outmatched. One day, walking past a scrap pile at Aberdeen, WWII noticed a length of steel tubing lying in the debris. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, and realized it was almost exactly the same diameter as the M10 grenade. The idea struck him with the force of revelation. Put the grenade in a tube, add a rocket motor to push it out, and you had a shoulder-fired weapon that could deliver a tank-killing charge from 100 yards away. Within weeks, WWII and his colleague Colonel Leslie Skinner had built a working prototype. The device was crude, a simple steel tube with a wooden stock, electrical contacts to ignite the rocket, and a trigger mechanism adapted from other weapons. When they realized on the morning of the first firing test that the prototype had no sights, they bent a wire coat hanger into a rough approximation of a rear sight and pressed on anyway. The test changed everything. The prototype was demonstrated at Aberdeen's competitive trial alongside various designs of spigot mortars, then considered the most promising approach to infantry anti-tank warfare. One by one, the spigot mortars fired at a moving target tank. One by one, they missed. Then WWII shouldered the tube, tracked the moving tank through his coat hanger sight, and fired. The rocket streaked downrange, struck the tank squarely, and detonated. He reloaded and fired again. Another hit. In a few minutes, the rocket launcher had scored more hits on a moving tank than all the spigot mortars combined had managed in hours of testing. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, who happened to be observing, ordered 5,000 units on the spot. By late 1942, the weapon officially designated as the Launcher, Rocket, 2.36-inch, anti-tank, M1 was in production at General Electric's Bridgeport facility. The troops who received them took one look at the strange tube and immediately nicknamed it after a popular novelty instrument played by 1930s comedian Bob Burns. The bazooka had arrived. The M1 bazooka was, by any standard, a remarkable weapon. Weighing just over 12 pounds, unloaded light enough for a single soldier to carry it, could propel a 3.5-pound rocket over 200 yards. The shaped charge warhead, containing 8 ounces of pentalite high explosive, could penetrate up to 3 inches of armor plate when striking perpendicular to the surface. That was enough to destroy or disable any tank then in German service through its side or rear armor. But the bazooka had limitations, and those limitations would become brutally apparent as the war progressed. The M1's rocket, designated M6, was notoriously unreliable. The electrical ignition system frequently failed, especially in wet or cold conditions. The sights were crude and difficult to use. The effective range, while impressive for an infantry weapon, was still far shorter than the engagement distance that tank crews preferred to maintain. And most critically, the warhead's 3-inch penetration, while adequate against the Panzer III and Panzer IV medium tanks of 1942, was woefully insufficient against the new generation of German armour. The first bazookas reached North Africa just in time for Operation Torch in November 1942. Reports from the field were mixed. The weapon worked sometimes. Against light armoured vehicles and fortified positions, it was devastatingly effective. Against tanks, results varied wildly depending on the specific vehicle, the angle of impact, and whether the rocket actually detonated at all. Within months, however, a far more serious problem emerged. German forces captured several bazookas from American and Soviet units. The weapon had been shipped to Russia under Lend-Lease and immediately recognized its potential. Nazi engineers reverse-engineered the design, but they made one critical modification. Where the American bazooka used a 60mm warhead, the German version used an 88mm warhead, increasing armor penetration by nearly 50%. They called it the Raketenpanzerbuchse, but frontline troops knew it by a simpler name, Panzerschreck, tank terror. American ordnance officers had argued for a larger warhead during development, but they had been overruled in the interest of weight savings and production simplicity. Now German infantry carried a weapon based on American innovation, but superior in the one metric that mattered most: killing power. By 1943, the Wehrmacht had begun deploying an entirely new class of heavy tank, one designed specifically to dominate the battlefield in ways the Panzer III and IV never could. The Panzerkampfwagen WWII Tiger Ausführung A, the Tiger I, entered service on the Eastern Front in August 1942 and immediately rewrote the rules of armoured warfare. Everything about the Tiger was designed for one purpose: overwhelming superiority at the point of contact. Its frontal armour was 100mm thick, more than twice the protection of the Panzer IV. Its 88mm main gun, with a muzzle velocity of 800 meters per second, could penetrate the armour of any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. At a weight of 56 metric tons, it was heavier than any tank the Americans had in service. Early encounters on the Eastern Front saw individual Tigers destroying dozens of Soviet tanks in single engagements. German propaganda amplified the Tiger's reputation to near mythical proportions. Tank aces like Michael Wittmann, credited with destroying over 100 enemy tanks and vehicles, became household names in Germany. The Tiger Fibel, the tank's official manual, was deliberately designed with crude humour and risque illustrations to ensure that young tank crews actually read it, understanding that the Tiger's complex systems required careful maintenance to function properly. The psychological effect was calculated and effective. German tank crews believed their machines were invincible, and for a time, they were nearly right, but no weapon is truly invulnerable. The Tiger had weaknesses, and Soviet and Allied forces set about methodically cataloguing them. Soviet artillery experts published detailed analyses of Tiger vulnerabilities in military journals. The rear armour, they noted, was only 80mm thick strong, but penetrable by anti-tank guns at moderate range. The engine ventilators on the rear deck presented an inviting target for incendiary weapons. The track system, while robust, could be disabled by direct hits, immobilizing the tank even if its armour remained intact. And most critically, the turret ring, the circular gap between the rotating turret and the fixed hull, was protected only by a narrow lip of armour that could be jammed or damaged by concentrated fire. The Americans conducted their own tests, and the results were sobering. The 2.36-inch bazooka could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armour under any circumstances. Side armour was theoretically vulnerable, but only at ranges under 100 yards, with a perpendicular hit, under ideal conditions. The rear armour offered the best chance of penetration, but getting behind a Tiger generally required surviving long enough to flank it, a proposition that few infantry squads could manage when facing the tank's devastating main gun and twin machine guns. Yet the tests also revealed something the Germans had overlooked. The Tiger's armour, while formidable, was not uniform. The vehicle's designers had concentrated protection on the surfaces most likely to face enemy fire: the front hull, the front turret, the sides. But there were gaps in the defensive scheme: access hatches, vision ports, ventilation grills, that were necessarily thinner than the main armour plates. The engine compartment, located in the rear of the hull, was protected not by solid armour, but by a steel grating that allowed air to flow to the Maybach engine. That grating could be penetrated by a shaped charge warhead. The bazooka manuals were updated with new targeting guidance. Frontline troops were trained to aim for specific weak points: the engine deck, the exhaust pipes, the turret ring, the track sprockets. They were told to close to suicidally short ranges if necessary: 20 meters, 15 meters, point blank if they could manage it, and fire at the vulnerable rear armour before the tank's crew could react. It was desperate tactics for desperate situations. Few soldiers who attempted to close with a tiger survived the attempt. But some did, and in those rare encounters, the results demonstrated that the Nazi myth of invincibility was exactly that, a myth. The Sicily campaign of July and August 1943 provided the first confirmed bazooka kills against Tiger tanks. German records indicate that 17 Tiger I tanks from Schwer Panzerabteilung 504 fought on the island against Allied forces, and the Americans discovered that while the bazooka struggled against frontal armor, it could be effective in the chaotic, close-quarters fighting of Sicilian villages. One kill became legendary within American ordnance circles. A bazooka gunner, the exact identity lost to history, scored what was described as an improbable hit through the driver's vision slot, threading a rocket through a gap only a few inches wide and detonating it inside the tank's crew compartment. The Germans had designed the Tiger's vision ports with armored glass and sliding steel covers. But in the heat of combat, crews often left ports partially open to maintain situational awareness. That momentary lapse cost 5 men their lives and proved that even the mightiest tank could be killed by a single well-aimed shot. The weapon evolved rapidly in response to combat experience. By late 1943, the improved M1A1 launcher and M6A3 rocket had entered service. The new rocket featured a blunted nose designed to prevent deflection off sloped armor, improved fins for better accuracy, and more reliable ignition. Penetration increased to approximately 4 inches of armor plate, still inadequate against Tiger frontal armor, but sufficient to punch through the thinner rear and side plates at close range. The M9 bazooka, introduced in October 1943, went further. Designed specifically for airborne units who needed a weapon that could be broken down for parachute drops, the M9 featured an improved magneto-ignition system that eliminated the troublesome battery, a longer barrel for better accuracy, and compatibility with all existing rocket types. At 61 inches long and weighing just over 15 pounds, it was more cumbersome than the original but significantly more reliable. These improvements mattered. As American forces pushed across France following the Normandy invasion, they encountered Tigers with increasing frequency. The fighting in the hedgerow country of Normandy proved particularly deadly. The thick bocage provided excellent concealment for German armor while limiting American tanks to predictable approaches along sunken lanes. Infantry anti-tank teams became essential to clearing the way, and the bazooka, for all its limitations, was often the only weapon available. The soldiers who carried bazookas into these engagements knew exactly what they were risking. Wehrmacht doctrine held that a competent Tiger crew could engage and destroy enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The bazooka's effective range against a Tiger was under 100 meters at best, meaning a bazooka team had to close to within 1/10 of the Tiger's engagement distance before they had any chance of a killing shot. At those ranges, a single burst from the tank's bow machine gun could wipe out an entire team. The 88mm main gun could destroy a building with a direct hit, eliminating any cover the team might use for approach. The casualty rates among bazooka teams reflected this brutal mathematics. Men volunteered anyway. Some were motivated by duty, some by hatred of the enemy, some by the simple recognition that if they did not stop the tank, it would kill their friends. Whatever their reasons, they went forward, crawling through rubble and mud, waiting for a moment when the Tiger's crew was distracted or the tank's rear was exposed, then rising to fire and praying the rocket found its mark. Most died in the attempt, but some, a precious few, succeeded. Which brings us back to Lucherberg, Germany, on the morning of December 5, 1944. George Burns had enlisted in the army shortly after Pearl Harbor. A native of New York, he had been assigned to the 415th Infantry Regiment of the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, known for their distinctive grey wolf shoulder patch and their commander's motto, "Nothing in hell can stop the Timberwolves." The division had arrived in Europe in September 1944 and immediately distinguished itself in bitter fighting through Belgium and into Germany. Burns had survived the brutal initial assault on Lucherberg, where his platoon had been cut to ribbons, taking the village from its German defenders. Now, less than 48 hours later, The Germans wanted it back, and they had brought a Tiger to make their point. The tank continued its methodical destruction of the village square. The ammunition truck was fully engulfed now, flames leaping 30 feet into the air. Another shell smashed into a building across the square, collapsing the entire front wall in a cascade of ancient masonry. German infantry were filtering in behind the tank, using its bulk as cover, firing at any American who showed himself. Burns made a decision. Someone had to stop that tank. He moved through the building, searching for a bazooka. The weapon his platoon had carried into the assault was gone, destroyed, lost, abandoned in the chaos of the previous day's fighting. He found no rockets, no launcher, nothing that could touch a Tiger. The platoon was virtually out of ammunition for their rifles. They were about to be annihilated. Then Burns spotted salvation in the village square. An American M10 Wolverine tank destroyer sat abandoned near a burning building, its crew either killed or having fled. The vehicle's own gun was useless, the destroyer had been knocked out, its engine dead, unable to maneuver. But strapped to the side of the M10, standard equipment for tank destroyer crews who might need to fight dismounted, was an M9 bazooka and several rockets. Burns ran. He sprinted across open ground, German machine gun fire kicking up cobblestones around his feet, and reached the tank destroyer. He grabbed the bazooka, slung the rocket bag over his shoulder, and sprinted back to cover as bullets whined past his head. A soldier he never identified, a man who remains anonymous to history, appeared beside him. "If you've got guts enough to go after that tank," the soldier said, "I'll help you with the ammo and reload for you." Burns nodded. Together, they moved toward the Tiger. The German tank crews had been told their armor was impervious to American infantry weapons. They had been told that the bazooka, while dangerous to lighter vehicles, could not penetrate Tiger armor except through extraordinary luck. They had been told, in essence, that as long as they kept their frontal armor toward the enemy and their hatches buttoned, no foot soldier could touch them. What they had not been told was that courage and desperation could close any range. Burns and his loader worked their way through the rubble, moving from doorway to doorway, pile of masonry to pile of masonry. The Tiger had stopped, firing momentarily, its turret traversing as the commander searched for new targets. German infantry moved through the square, but their attention was focused on the American positions across the plaza, not on the ruins to their flank. Burns closed to within 50 feet of the tank. He raised the bazooka, sighted on the Tiger's flank, and fired. The rocket streaked across the gap in a fraction of a second. The shaped charge detonated against the tank's side armor with a sharp crack, distinctly different from the boom of high explosives. Burns did not wait to see the result. He ducked back into the doorway, his loader already feeding another rocket into the tube. The first round had missed the critical components. The Tiger's side armor, 80 millimeters thick, had partially deflected the warhead's penetrating jet. The tank lurched, the driver apparently startled, but did not stop. The turret began rotating toward Burns's position. He fired again. This second round struck lower, near the track assembly. Still not a killing shot, but the impact clearly alarmed the crew. The tank began backing up, trying to put distance between itself and this unexpected threat. German infantry scattered, suddenly aware that American soldiers were far closer than they had realized. Burns was not going to let the tank escape. He burst from the doorway and into the open street, fully exposed, running directly toward the retreating Tiger. The tank was turning now, trying to present its frontal armor, but the narrow streets of Lucherberg did not allow for rapid maneuvers. Burns fired a third round while moving a nearly impossible shot under normal circumstances, and missed. He kept advancing. The loader shouted something, probably a warning about the machine gun, but Burns was beyond hearing. He had entered that strange battlefield state where fear transforms into something else entirely, where the possibility of death becomes an abstract consideration weighed against the immediate. Need to destroy the enemy. The Tiger's bow machine gun opened fire. Bullets cracked past Burns's head. One tugged at his sleeve, close enough to feel the wind of its passage. He kept moving, angling now, trying to get around the tank's flank as it continued its ponderous turn. And then he saw it. The Tiger had completed its turn onto the main road leading north out of the village, and in doing so had presented its rear to Burns's position. The engine deck, with its distinctive grille of ventilator slats, was directly in front of him at a range of perhaps 20 feet. He stopped. He raised the bazooka. He aimed at the ventilator, the point he had been trained to target, the one weakness in the Tiger's otherwise formidable armor scheme. He fired. The rocket covered the distance in less than a second. The shaped charge struck the ventilator grille and punched through, the focused jet of superheated copper and explosive gases penetrating into the engine compartment beyond. Fuel lines ruptured, hydraulic fluid ignited. Within seconds, smoke began pouring from every seam and opening in the Tiger's rear hull. The tank did not explode immediately. Tigers rarely did, their fuel tanks being protected by self-sealing technology, but it was finished. The crew had perhaps 60 seconds to abandon the vehicle before the fire reached the ammunition storage. The hatches flew open. 5 German tankers scrambled out, coughing and burning. Burns shot them with his rifle as they emerged. Later, witnesses would describe what happened next in almost identical terms. Burns stood in the middle of the street, enemy soldiers fleeing past him, a 60-ton tank burning behind him, entirely alone. He had done what Wehrmacht doctrine said was impossible. He had closed with a Tiger and killed it. The citation for his Distinguished Service Cross reads, in part, "On the morning of December 5, 1944, the enemy launched a vicious counterattack with tanks and infantry on the time, company to which Sergeant Burns was assigned. An enemy tank penetrated the company's position, knocking out the anti-tank defense, delivering direct fire on the company command post, destroying all communications, and wounding the company commander. Realizing that his platoon's bazookas had been destroyed, Sergeant Burns, at great risk to his life and in the face of direct fire from the enemy tank and supporting infantry, obtained a bazooka from a damaged tank destroyer." The citation continues. Unable to find a covered position providing a field of fire, Sergeant Burns fired the bazooka from a point in the open street, seeking cover only to reload his weapon. He fired a total of 10 rounds at the enemy tank, killing 8 of the supporting infantrymen and setting the tank on fire with a well-aimed round through the tank's ventilator. The tank was forced to withdraw, and, at great risk to his life, Sergeant Burns courageously pursued it down the open street, stopped the tank with his last round, and killed the crew with his rifle as they abandoned the burning tank. 10 rounds, 8 enemy infantrymen killed, 1 Tiger destroyed, 1 man. George Burns was not the only American soldier to accomplish the supposedly impossible during the war. The records reveal a pattern. Wherever infantry faced Tigers without tank support of their own, there were soldiers who found ways to fight back. In Sicily in 1943, at least 4 medium German tanks and 1 Tiger fell to bazooka fire, including the famous shot through the driver's vision slot. During Operation Nordwind in January 1945, a bazooka team achieved what was described as the unlikely destruction of a Jag Tiger, the heaviest armoured fighting vehicle of the war, mounting 250 millimeters of frontal armour, by manoeuvring to get a shot at its thinner side plating. During the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944, Major Charles Carpenter, known as Bazooka Charlie, mounted 6 M9 bazookas on his L-4 Grasshopper observation aircraft and used them to attack German armour from above, claiming 6 tanks destroyed, including 2 Tigers. Each of these kills required extraordinary circumstances: extreme close range, perfect shot placement, or attack from an unexpected angle. The bazooka never became an effective counter to heavy German armour in the way that the British 17-pounder or American 90mm gun did. It remained, fundamentally, a weapon of desperation useful against fortifications, light vehicles, and medium tanks, but reliable against Tigers only when wielded by soldiers willing to accept near-certain death in exchange for a chance at the kill. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German response to these losses reveals how thoroughly the Tiger's crew had internalized the myth of their own invincibility. After-action reports from Tiger battalions in France and the Rhineland consistently describe encounters with bazooka teams as anomalies, freak occurrences that could be dismissed as the result of extraordinary luck or inexperienced crews. German tank commanders were reluctant to admit that American infantry, armed only with a weapon derived from their own captured technology, could pose a serious threat. This institutional denial had consequences. Tank crews who believed themselves immune to infantry weapons grew careless. They operated with hatches open for better visibility, not realizing that this made them vulnerable to infantry weapons they had been told could not hurt them. They advanced through villages without adequate infantry support, confident that their armor would protect them from any threat. They presented their rear armor to potential threats, never imagining that a single soldier might be waiting with a bazooka. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine, had warned against exactly this mentality. Combined arms warfare, the integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft into a mutually supporting whole, was supposed to be the foundation of German tactical excellence. But as losses mounted and manpower dwindled, Wehrmacht commanders increasingly threw tanks into battle without adequate support, trusting in their technological superiority to overcome tactical shortcomings. The Americans exploited this overconfidence ruthlessly. Infantry anti-tank training intensified as the war progressed. Soldiers learned to identify Tiger weak points, the engine deck ventilators, the turret ring, the rear exhaust pipes, the track sprockets. They learned to work in teams, with one man drawing the tank's attention, while another closed from the flank. They learned to use terrain, rubble, buildings, ditches, hedgerows to approach within killing range. Most importantly, they learned that the Tiger, for all its fearsome reputation, was crewed by men who could be surprised, panicked, and killed. The psychological dimension of these lessons proved as important as the tactical ones. German tank crews who had grown accustomed to operating with impunity began to report increased anxiety about infantry threats. Post-war interrogations revealed that veteran tankers grew increasingly reluctant to enter close-terrain villages, forests, built-up areas where bazookas might be lurking. The very weapon that German propagandists had dismissed as inadequate was changing German tactical behavior. This shift was most evident during the final months of the war. In the fighting east of the Rhine in early 1945, Tiger battalions reported persistent harassment from American infantry anti-tank teams. The great tank battles of the open steppe were a distant memory. Now the Tigers fought in Germany's cities and villages, the same close terrain where bazookas were most effective. Losses mounted, not primarily from tank-on-tank engagements, but from infantry weapons, artillery, and airstrikes. George Burns survived the war. Wounded by artillery later in December 1944, he was evacuated to England for treatment, returning in time to cross the Rhine with the Timberwolves. In April 1945, he destroyed another German tank. The records do not specify whether it was a Tiger, and received the Silver Star along with a battlefield commission to second lieutenant. Major General Terry Allen, commander of the 104th Infantry Division, personally awarded Burns his Silver Star and pinned the gold bar of a second lieutenant on his shoulder. Burns never learned the name of the soldier who had volunteered to load for him at Lucherberg, the anonymous man who had said, "If you've got guts enough to go after that tank, I'll help you with the ammo and reload for you." The loader vanished into the chaos of combat, never to be identified, one of millions whose contributions to victory went unrecognized. Burns returned to civilian life after the war. He settled in Florida, raised a family, and rarely spoke of what he had done at Lucherberg, except to fellow veterans and the occasional historian. When author Alin Vanoy tracked him down for a book about the 104th Division's actions, Burns provided a characteristically understated account of the morning he killed a Tiger. "What I accomplished at Lucherberg that day," he wrote, "was to turn the tide of battle and single-handedly drive the Germans out of the area, destroying a huge tank to boot." He died in March 1994. 50 years after the day he proved that courage could overcome armor. The lessons of Lucherberg and Sicily, and Aracourt, and 100 other forgotten engagements, would shape American infantry anti-tank doctrine for decades. The 3.5-inch M20 Super Bazooka, developed too late to see significant action in World War II, entered. service in Korea in 1950, with vastly improved armor penetration. The M72 light anti-tank weapon, the M136AT4, and the FGM-148 Javelin all trace their lineage back to Colonel Skinner's coat-hanger-sighted prototype fired at Aberdeen in 1942. Each generation of anti-tank weapon improved on the formula. More penetration, better range, more reliability. But the fundamental tactical problem remained the same. A man on foot, armed with a tube and a rocket, facing a machine designed to destroy everything in its path. Success still required what it had always required: the willingness to close with the enemy despite impossible odds, to risk everything on a single shot. The German tankers who died at Lucherberg had believed themselves invincible. They had been trained to trust their armor, to dismiss infantry weapons as nuisances rather than threats. They had absorbed the propaganda, internalized the myths, convinced themselves that no foot, soldier could touch them. George Burns was not aware of German propaganda. He did not know what Wehrmacht briefings said about the bazooka's limitations. He only knew that a tank was killing his friends, and he had to stop it. He closed to 20 feet. He fired. And he proved that the most powerful weapon on any battlefield is not steel or high explosive, but the human being willing to use them. The Tiger weighed 56 tons. Its armor was 100 millimeters thick. Its gun could kill any tank in the Allied arsenal from 2,000 meters away. It was, by every measurable standard, the most formidable ground weapon of World War II. It fell to a single man with a tube. That is the truth the Wehrmacht could never accept, the reality that no amount of propaganda could obscure. Wars are not won by wonder weapons. They are won by soldiers like George Burns, ordinary men who, faced with impossible circumstances, choose to attack anyway. 56 tons of German engineering, 12 pounds of American determination. The 12 pounds won. The 104th Infantry Division fought on through the final months of the war. The Timberwolves crossed the Rhine, captured Cologne, and pushed deep into the German heartland. In April 1945, they liberated the Nordhausen concentration camp and the Dora Mittelbau slave labour complex, where prisoners had built the V-2 rockets that terrorized London. They linked up with Soviet forces on the Elbe River in the final days of the European War. Of the division's 4,961 battle casualties in the European theatre, 1,119 were deaths. Among the wounded, among the dead, among the missing, were men who had carried bazookas into combat against tigers, panthers, and everything else the Wehrmacht threw at them. Most of their names are forgotten. Their courage is not. The M9 bazooka that George Burns carried that morning in Lucherberg weighed 15 pounds and could fire up to 10 rockets per minute in practiced hands. Its effective range against a tiger was measured in feet, not yards. To use it against a heavy tank required closing to a distance where the tank's machine guns could not miss, where a single misjudgment meant death. Burns knew all of this. He went anyway. He succeeded. That is the story of the bazooka versus the tiger. Not a story of technological triumph. The bazooka never truly outmatched German armor, but a story of human will overcoming mechanical advantage. The Germans built the most powerful tank of the war. The Americans built a weapon that gave ordinary soldiers a chance against it. The difference came down to the men willing to use that chance. Wehrmacht doctrine held that a Tiger was worth 5 Sherman tanks in combat. Wehrmacht doctrine held that infantry could not threaten a Tiger outside of extraordinary circumstances. Wehrmacht doctrine held that armor, properly employed, was the decisive arm of warfare. All of this was true. But warfare is not conducted according to doctrine. It is conducted by human beings with all their flaws and all their capacity for courage. And human beings, pushed to the limit, will find ways to win that no doctrine can predict. George Burns found a way. So did the anonymous soldier who loaded for him. So did thousands of other American infantrymen who faced tigers with nothing but bazookas and determination. Some of them died. Many of them died. But enough of them succeeded that the myth of invincibility crumbled, one smoking hulk at a time. That is what the Wehrmacht could not understand. You can build a tank that cannot be penetrated, You cannot build a tank that cannot be approached. You cannot build a tank that cannot be surprised. You cannot build a tank that cannot be destroyed by a man willing to die to destroy it. The Tiger was supposed to be invincible. 20 meters and 1 bazooka round proved it was not. History remembers the tanks. History should remember the men who killed them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.